Well, good evening and Happy New Year. Welcome to the January edition of Sky Views, brought to you by the New Jersey State Museum Planetarium. I'm Bill Murray, planetarium technician at the Planetarium. Let's take a look at some of the interesting sights visible in our chilly January skies this year. We're currently looking towards the east about 6:30 p.m., just after the end of astronomical twilight, on the evening of January 3rd. And as you can see above our eastern horizon, some of the very bright constellations of winter are beginning to rise and become pretty prominent. As I've said before here at Sky Views, winter's the time of year when you get to see more bright stars than any other time of year, and we can see several examples of that looking east on the evening of January 3rd. We have two constellations of the zodiac, the constellation of Taurus the Bull, with its two bright star clusters, the V-shaped group called the Hyades, that marks out the face of the bull, with the bright orange star Aldebaran marking the bull's eye, and also above it, the bright star cluster, the Pleiades, also known as the Seven Sisters. The other constellation of the zodiac is just rising now above the horizon, and that is the constellation of Gemini, the twins, with its two bright stars, Castor and Pollux. In addition to those two constellations, we have two other bright constellations. The constellation of Auriga the Charioteer, with the bright star Capella, and probably the most famous winter constellation of all, the constellation of Orion, the Hunter, with its two bright stars, Rigel in the hunter's foot and Betelgeuse in his shoulders, and the three bright stars, Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka, marking the famous belt of Orion. In addition to the bright constellations of winter, we have two other bright objects visible in this view of our eastern sky. The moon, being a few days before full moon, and the planet Mars. Let's take a close-up view with those two. Whenever two objects in our solar system appear to be close to each other in our skies, that's called a conjunction of planets, or conjunction of planets with the moon. And this is the first of three interesting conjunctions that we have this month. So if you look in the constellation of Taurus in our eastern sky, you'll see the almost full moon, which will be unmistakable. And then above it and a few degrees away and a little bit to the right will be what looks like a very bright orange star. But that's not a star, that's the planet Mars. This isn't the best view of Mars that we'll have this month. More about that in a few minutes. We had a spectacular conjunction of the Moon and Mars last month on December 7th. Mars made a very close approach to the Moon. This image, shown here, was captured that evening by Robert Vanderby, a member of the Princeton University faculty, an author and astrophotographer, and also a member of the Amateur Astronomers Association of Princeton, showing the south pole of the Moon sliding very close and just slightly over the planet Mars. Very luckily achieved that evening because the weather wasn't that great. We were actually a bit unlucky here in New Jersey because most of the country got to see an even rarer occurrence. Not a conjunction, but an occultation, where the moon actually moved in front of and covered up Mars. We'll have another close conjunction at the end of this month, not quite as good as this one, but fairly close. The next of our three bright conjunctions occurs not in the eastern sky, but in the western sky. So we're looking towards the west, very low in the west, on the evening of January 22nd, about 6 p.m., just after sunset, and when there's still a little bit of twilight in the evening sky. And we see a very close conjunction of the planets Venus and Saturn. This will be a very tough conjunction to see. It occurs very low in the west, just after sunset, and so you will need a very low western horizon to be able to see it. You also may need a pair of binoculars to separate Venus and Saturn, which will be less than a half a degree apart. Venus is much brighter than Saturn, more than 70 times. So if you have a pair of binoculars, that should be able to separate the two planets. Venus will appear brilliantly white, and Saturn just a little bit to the right and above it will be a much dimmer shade of yellow. The third, and probably the best of the moon-planet conjunctions this month, occurs on the last day of the month. Here we're looking towards the west early on the morning, about 12:50 of January 31st. Again, we're looking at the constellation of Taurus the Bull, which is now setting in the west, as opposed to the earlier conjunctions in the month when it was rising in the east. And again, we have a very close conjunction between the planet Mars and the moon. A close-up view shows the gibbous moon. That's the phase of the moon in between first quarter moon, when it looks half full in our evening skies, and full moon, when it's completely bright and round and in the sky all night long. And the moon is passing just below Mars on the early morning of January 31st. This conjunction will be much better than the one that occurred earlier in the month on January 3rd, but not as close as the near occultation that occurred last month on December 7th. An even closer view shows significant surface detail on both the moon and Mars, similar to what you would see through a small telescope. Unlike the conjunction in December, though, Mars is probably far enough away from the moon that you won't be able to fit both into the same view. However, if you do have a small telescope, now is a great time to take a look at Mars. It is still relatively large. It is moving away from the Earth after its opposition last month, but still probably the best view of Mars we'll see for the next several years. So if you have a chance and the weather is clear and you didn't get a chance to see the close conjunction of the moon and Mars in December, make sure you get out on January 31st, just a little bit after midnight, and you'll be able to see it again. Back in mid-month, on the evening of January 15th, about 9 p.m., looking towards the east, we can see that the winter constellations have all risen now and are very prominent. We also see the very prominent asterism called the winter circle or the winter hexagon, which starts at Rigel in the leg of Orion the Hunter, and then proceeds to Aldebaran in Taurus the Bull, Capella in Auriga the Charioteer, the twin stars Castor and Pollux in the constellation of Gemini the Twins, Procyon in the constellation of Canis Minor the Small Dog, and last but not least Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky in the constellation of Canis Major the Big Dog. As we usually do, we like to focus on one constellation every month, and this month we're going to talk a little bit about the zodiac constellation of Gemini, the twins. The constellation Gemini represents the mythological twin brothers Castor and Polydeuces. In Latin that translates to Pollux. And the brothers were sons of Queen Leda of Sparta, but with different fathers. Castor's father was King Dindyrus of Sparta, Leda's husband, but Polydeuces' father was the Greek god Zeus, who had a liaison with Leda, very famous in mythology. Despite the fact that they had different fathers, the brothers were inseparable and formed an inseparable pair and went on many adventures together. They accompanied the Argonauts and Jason on their search for the Golden Fleece and had many other adventures at sea. And due to that fact, in ancient times, they were considered patron gods of sailors, and many ships had their symbol on them to protect them from storms, as is noted by St. Paul in the Acts of the Apostles about his voyage to Rome. If you take a look in the feet of the constellation of Castor, you'll see one of the brightest open clusters in the night sky. the very famous open cluster M35. M35 is easily visible in a small pair of binoculars as a bright open cluster with several hundred very bright young stars. It was discovered in the year 1745 by the French astronomer de Chasseau, noted a few years later by the English astronomer John Bevis, and then later added to the list of non-comet deep sky objects that was written up by the French astronomer Charles Messier. If you have a small telescope, though, M35 is a treat for another reason. It's a 2-for-1 object. So in our picture here, you can see to the lower right of the bright large cluster M35 is another open cluster called NGC 2158, which is unrelated to M35. It's much richer and much more distant. M35 is about 9,000 light years away, and NGC 2158 is more than 18,000 light years away. Well, that's a look at some of the interesting sights visible this month from our skies here in New Jersey. Hopefully the weather will be not quite so frigid as to prevent you from going out and trying to observe them for yourselves. And next month we'll dive a little bit more into the constellations of winter. Till then, from all of us here at the New Jersey State Museum Planetarium, clear skies.